Okay, perfect. So peace, y'all. Thank you for joining us tonight for our AFRICOM, Pan-Africanism, and Global Blackness teach-in. We'll introduce ourselves in a second, but we're very happy that y'all are here and with us for the next 2 hours. Um, so just to go over our schedule, we're gonna do like a quick introduction, talking about who BKC is. Then we're going to be, the first part of the teach-in is going to be thinking about AFRICOM, the systems of oppression are on, that are the boots on our necks, identifying our enemies. Then we'll have a short break, and then we'll talk about what is Pan-Africanism, how can we incorporate Pan-Africanist ideologies into our organizing practices, and then we will close with the discussion, reflections, X, Y, and Z. So you can go to the next slide. Okay, so what is the Black Knowledge Coalition? So we were formed on the first day of Black History Month in 2021 by New African and Black students at George Washington University, although we're not limited to university students. We view political education as a necessary tool for mass organization and revolutionary world building. So again, like thinking about it as a tool, not only just not thinking about it as the only way of achieving a revolution. We understand that we have to theorize, we have to read, we have to strategize together, but that is just one tool in our arsenal for mass organization through a Pan-Africanist lens. And what's specific about BKC is that we utilize the archive and storytelling methods to deliver this information, and think about political education. And we also exploit our relationships to the academy. So, like I was saying, a majority of us are former or like graduates from universities. So we essentially engage in this kind of like digital looting of the resources that are held within the university because they are largely inaccessible to the masses, usually behind a paywall or some sort of like two-part verification, authentication. So we use our ability to access those, take them and make them accessible to the masses. We do this through texts, teach-ins, book giveaways, also providing reading lists, etc. So, for instance, for Black August, which recently just passed, we had a reading list of various texts like The Tip of the Spear by Orsami Burton. And in our virtual library, we had all of those texts available for people to download and also view on their own time. And then we have sample text, The History of the Black Radical Tradition, which is available on our website. So if people want to read those, they're about like a 10 to 15-minute read, really breaking down like key concepts that we utilize in our organizing practices and circles. I was looking through our Instagram to look at images, and I remember that we had a mutual aid book bash. And we should bring that back. We should think about bringing that back. Yeah, we had a lot of books from our partners at Haymarket Books, and we were able to distribute them to the community. And we had a really vast assortment of books, which I thought was really, really useful. And then lastly, our most recent post was kind of a short overview of Robert F. Williams. In 2025 is his centennial, and a few days ago was the anniversary of his passing. So we wanted to honor him by just showcasing like who he was and think about his legacy or his place in establishing the legacy of armed self-defense within a Black radical tradition, but also a global liberation movement. So those are just some examples. But to continue talking about who we are, we're a coalition of Black and New African women and genderqueer organizers who are already members of or closely aligned with established Black/New African liberation organizations. So for instance, outside of BKC, I'm a member of the Malcolm X grassroots movement, which is a national organization that works to free political prisoners and organizes around the concept or the ideology and promise of the Republic of New Africa. And I'm also a founding organizer of the Providence chapter of Jericho Movement, which is also another organization to free political prisoners. So we are already in these networks, and we want to come together to think about political education as a tool to bring back to our organizations to make these things, these concepts more accessible to the masses. So, in sum, To sum it up, we are niggas who just like to read and we value political education. And if you're interested in joining us, my comrade Genevieve will post our Get Involved link below, which is on our website if you also want to visit that. Or you can also reach out to any of us through Instagram or email or personally. So yeah, we can get into it.
Woo! Thank you, Giovanna. Hey y'all, I'm Peyton. My pronouns are they, them. Um, I am a member of Black Alliance for Peace Chicago. But most importantly, I'm a member of Black Knowledge Coalition. This is my home. I love my comrades and I love these people, period. So I'm here to talk to y'all about AFRICOM.
Boo this man!
I'm so sorry. That's so unserious. Boo, AFRICOM. So the reason why we wanted to have this teaching this month, last year I think we did it for Black History Month, but October is the fifth International Month of Action Against AFRICOM, as introduced by Black Alliance for Peace. Black Alliance for Peace is an international organization, and so people all around the world, especially places that are impacted by U.S. and global empire, are doing things like this teaching. Some people are doing like mutual aid drives, just to raise people's political consciousness around AFRICOM and how it ravages our people. So, how did AFRICOM start? Hold on, let me start my timer, y'all, because I will keep y'all here yapping for 86 years. Okay. AFRICOM started, so AFRICOM stands for Africa Command. Crazy name. It is a US led military institution and it goes across 53 countries in on the continent, and it's actually headquartered in Germany. So to the US military, Africa is a strategically significant place, especially as they justify the existence of AFRICOM through combating like global extremism and the war on terror. We're across an entire ocean. One would conclude that means we should mind our business, but it instead that means that they wanted to have AFRICOM. The real goal of AFRICOM, as we understand it as Pan-Africanists, is to the real how we understand the real goal of AFRICOM is to protect U.S. military and imperial interests through economic and political control across the continent. And right here, this goofy looking dude is the current commander of AFRICOM. They have new commanders. This is General Dagvin Anderson. Crazy name, Dagvin. Do y'all know anybody named Dagvin? Anyway, these are the former commanders of AFRICOM. Why are we showing y'all these people? Because it's important to know that they're the like US empire isn't just like this amalgamous force that comes down from the heavens and moves chess pieces to ruin all of our lives and the lives of our comrades on the ground and the continent. These are individuals who make decisions to facilitate the destruction and the displacement of our people. So this is all available on like the AFRICOM website. So AFRICOM started in 2007 by actually George W. Bush right before he got out of office. He wanted to create more pathways for the West to dominate Africa. He launched AFRICOM under the Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, who is this other goofy looking dude right here, who actually continued AFRICOM under the Obama administration. AFRICOM is a uniquely American project with partners in like the EU, and across NATO, the North Atlantic Trade Organization. It is an American project that ensures continued oppression and stunted liberation of the African people, all while advancing US and European economic and military goals. And what we have written right here is not far from what they actually have on the AFRICOM website. Like, this is how they divide up the components of AFRICOM. Again, it's important for y'all to know this because it really draws a lot of connection to the partners that are involved in facilitating the different operations under AFRICOM. So there's these different units. There's the U.S. Army, Europe, the U.S. Southern European Task Force, which is located in Italy. The Naval Forces, also located in Italy. The Air Force is in Germany, based in Germany. The Marine Corps, also based in Germany. And then the only one, as y'all can see, the last two are in Germany as well. But the only one that is headquartered in on the continent actually is Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti, and that is because it's in the Horn of Africa. Why is the Horn of Africa important? Well, real quick, this is on their website. Y'all see that white military hand shaking that black hand? Ain't that crazy? Like we something with we the reason we wanted to do this t-shirt for many reasons, but it's really key and important to show that like they're not hiding this, y'all. Like it's in our faces. Like literally screen grab this from the website. Like here, white man, thank you so much for invading my country and destabilizing our economy. So this is the Horn of Africa here on the right. As you can see, it has proximity to West Asia. And the left, you see Sudan, which should be a unified Sudan, but there's Sudan and then South Sudan. In the Horn of Africa, it contains Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, and Somalia. So they're headquartered right there. And can I do a laser pointer? I'm not going to try to do that right now. So like right here in the middle, it's like right there next to West Asia. When I say West Asia, I'm referring to the quote unquote Middle East. Why am I not saying the Middle East? Because what does that mean? Those are two directional words. Middle of whom, east of whom, important to think about. West Asia is geographically specific and accurate. So the Western imperialist powers justify AFRICOM in three main ways. So that is one, protecting the resource interests of NATO, and two, counterterrorism. We'll get into that in a second. And three, competing with China. Okay. So these are the kind of the three ways that we're going to break into what AFRICOM is and how it's operating on the continent. But what's important is when uh, W. Bush was president, one of the ways that they justified creating AFRICOM is because like pre or after 9/11, the whole like development politic of Africa, like the quote unquote starving child in Africa, like that meme of Kim Kardashian where it's like people are dying. That Africa is portrayed as like a war torn, deeply undemocratic place of savages who are desperate for Western aid. Sound familiar? Probably. That's just the MO of colonialism. And AFRICOM is based on, well, one of the ways is the resource extraction from Africa. That's like the economic driver of AFRICOM, in addition to military weapon sales. So the war on terror was what catalyzed American imperialism to just really like get back into Africa in terms of like in extractive ways. Well, it's always been extractive, but um, before the Bush administration began AFRICOM, it was a site of like individual philanthropic corporate aid ventures. So think like again the starving children, the wives of these billionaires are having these fundraisers to build a watering hole somewhere random that they've never been to or have no desire to go to. Who the water well probably wasn't even built. Um, but with the establishment of AFRICOM, it kind of like streamlined this resource extraction and also bolstered existing military presence on the continent. So to be clear, like AFRICOM wasn't the start of U.S. military presence in Africa. Like we were, oh, not me, but the U.S. military was already there. This just streamlined and justified a heavier presence to have more resource extraction. So the US and NATO, and again, NATO is a North Atlantic Trade Organization, interjected itself on the continent to advance the extraction of Africa's natural resources by placing military bases across the continent and coercing national leaders to sell land to foreigners. That last part is key. They use coercive violence, they might have used political power, whatever means they decided to get the national leaders to sell the land to foreigners to conduct this resource extraction. And right here on the right, we have sites of AFRICOM and just including like some of these are just the top two resources that they're extracting from these different places on the continent. This is just two. Like some places like Gabon and Tunisia, they have like more like copper, uranium, but a variety of minerals, and of course, it always comes back to oil. Now, some places like Sao Tome and Senegal, they might not be as resource rich, but they provide a key like location benefit four imperial powers. They're by the water. Sao Tome is an island. And as we know from our comrades in the side of struggle in Hawaii, like the Navy is all up in Hawaii because it's an island and they're a strategic location. They're a strategic location. So think of Sao Tome as kind of a similar thing. Um, so before AFRICOM, Africa was divided into three imperial commands. Again, AFRICOM wasn't the start of the US military's presence or any foreign military presence on the continent. There was European Command, crazy, the Central Command, and the Pacific Command. So EUCOM, CENTCOM, and PACOM, PACOM, I don't know, all this is bad and stupid. But UCOM claimed control over most of Central Africa. I'm laughing because this is contemporary. Like it's really important to note this is contemporary, but these are such like archaic models of colonialism that I think especially now as we're seeing like a lack of critical thinking skills, it's important to remember that these are all contemporary methods. When I say contemporary, I mean like in the last 20 years um, of imperial control in Africa. So let me continue. CENTCOM claimed control over Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Djibouti, Somalia, and Kenya. Pacific-Com claimed control over Madagascar, the Seychelles, and the Indian Ocean, that region off of the African coast. So that's on the east coast of Africa. And then Egypt was its own operation under CENTCOM because of its proximity to West Asia. So if we're thinking back to what I showed y'all about the Horn of Africa, this is so like the Horn of Africa is right under there. There's Sudan, there's Eritrea. So they had Egypt as its own control because I had to cover that up because that ain't it has some fake word. I don't know if y'all ever heard Israel. Do y'all know what that is? I only know this is Palestine, but they have direct access to this area where we already know the Bush family was all up in there. And their good pals in the UAE is also right here. So Egypt was its own operation just because of its like location prowess. But again, they're still very close to the Horn of Africa. So that's why they decided to like when they constructed AFRICOM, the Horn of Africa is its own command, just like Egypt was its own command and still is, I believe. So zooming out a little bit, money is always involved. Capitalism is the driving force of imperialism. There are two sides of the same coin, ugly, ugly, dirty, stinky coin. And through AFRICOM's foreign military sales programs, this is a real program, war corporations like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, which changed their name to RTX, but don't get it twisted. It's like Twitter changing to X. Y'all are both bad. They sell U.S. military partners. Partners is a very, I'm saying partners loosely because I don't think there's a partnership when things are coerced. But they sell bombs and other weapons directly to the continent through this foreign military sales program under AFRICOM. So, for example, Lockheed Martin sold F-16 fighter jets in Botswana and Egypt and Morocco to the military bases there. So, oh, and then Raytheon also sold missiles in Morocco that were built on U.S. soil by Raytheon in Arizona. So, when we're thinking about the connection of militarism as it exists in the U.S., but also as it expands onto the continent, there's a lot of connecting tissues here. There's the climate piece, so like just thinking about what it means to be having these gallons and gallons and gallons and gallons and gallons of oil, which I'll get into in a second, that has to power these fighter jets, right? Why does Egypt need these fighter jets? That's another connecting tissue. We could do a whole teaching on Egypt and its complicity with the U.S. war machine. But a way to kind of tie a bow on it is the US's goal above anything else is to not just establish but maintain military control across the globe. And they do that by tying in military and like private corporations so that they can be like, oh well, we're just supporting business. It's out of our hands. We're just giving them avenues to conduct business. But really, these programs like the Foreign Military Sales Program are facilitating the various like violent the various violent components of imperialism that we know. And when we say things like free Sudan, free the Congo, like this is what we're freeing them from. It's not just like a blanket statement. It's these specific pieces that we're fighting to free our people from. And then also tech companies, as I think has kind of become popular knowledge, but again, critical thinking is at an all-time low. Um, Tech companies are deeply invested in the countries that AFRICOM is being operated in this resource extraction. So Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, Uganda, and the Congo. So these companies, Apple, Dell, Tesla, Meta, Google, IBM, Oracle, which I think is an AI company, Hewlett Packard, Microsoft, and Amazon are all complicit in the imperialist devastation across Africa. And the places that have asterisks are currently listed in a lawsuit for child deaths in the Congo's cobalt mines. So when we're going back to these countries on the right, and we're seeing all these different mining industries of diamonds, manganese. That sounds like a Pokemon. Pokemon, sorry, I love Pokemon. Phosphate, uranium, like these companies are relying on these different minerals and oil to give us these phones, the computer that I'm doing this teaching on. Again, these are things that are starting to enter common knowledge, but it's important that as Pan Africanists and as people who are invested in the liberation of all African people, all Black people, in these conversations, we can't just say things like, um, we can't just say things like Apple is killing kids in the Congo. Well, yes, but like how? Through what means? Apple is investing in the mining of these specific minerals that build our phones, and the miners are children. They're child mines. And so again, following the money is a good way to connect between how AFRICOM, again, the military, is facilitating these connections. It's easier for US corporations to have these again, I hate saying partnerships because they're not partnerships, but have these relationships with the military because the military has bases in these countries under AFRICOM. So there's kind of like a precedent for foreign involvement and a foreign presence in these countries. And again, just bringing this home, regardless of their specific objectives, NATO, again, that's the US and the EU basically, is sacrificing the lives of millions, and it's probably hundreds of millions actually, to advance their interests and increase their profit margins. This is not me jumping to conclusions. This is not us pushing our socialist agenda. Well, it's a little bit of that. But this is from the AFRICOM website. Like, this is straight from the horse's mouth. Um, and with that being said, y'all can either drop it in the chat or you can come off mute for a second. But can y'all think of any contemporary or historical examples of the West profiting from militarism in Africa?
I like always think about like the idea of like blood diamonds. Um, and like I believe um what was it, Sudan? Potentially. I don't know. But I think but like blood diamonds um in like Africa. Not entirely sure what region though.
Absolutely. The diamond mining industry, um, the what creates the quote unquote crown jewels that we have been told to admire from the British Empire. That is an excellent example. So again, this when you think of the spoils of Western capitalism, it's key to understand that a lot of that is the backs of African people. Like it's a one to one. It's not a whole lot of space in between. So that was a good example. Thank you, Judan. Anyone else?
I know historically there's been like attacks on US embassies on the African
Mm-hmm.
continent, like as resistance. And I feel like I'm sure there's a way the money all connects, but also just like the way that like the West can like use those instances to victimize itself and then like further like support whatever militarization they're doing in those different areas. I wish I had a specific example, but I know there's been plenty.
Yeah, no, that's actually really helpful. That's a great example. And Javon is going to get into like resistance a little bit later, so I'll just kind of let that hang there. But that was a great example. Thank you. Okay. So, case study real quick. In August of this year, Nigeria produced over 1.8 million barrels of oil in a day. A day. A day. Crazy. Um, Most of which is exported to the West. Okay. So crude oil production accounts for over two-thirds of the state's revenue and yields over 80% of the foreign currency that's critical to stabilizing Nigeria's economy. There is not any organic, like in country flow of commerce. Like it's Nigeria's economy is deeply, deeply reliant on foreign currency, and that includes tourism. I'm sure y'all know people or have seen people who have traveled to Nigeria and ever. But even like tourism is included in this, the foreign currency flow. And this graph just shows over the years. If we want to go to like, I don't know, 2005, 2010, like halfway through those lines where like AFRICOM would start, had started, girl, you can't make this up. You see how that shot up right there? And it stayed pretty much over that first line. There's a little bit of a major dip at what looks like around like 2018. I wish these intervals were more equal. Whoever made this map, actually, I do know. The International Energy Agency, y'all got to get better graphs. But y'all can see the way that the oil output has increased. And just to continue this case study of Nigeria, these are the top three shareholders of Nigeria's primary oil production company, which is called Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation. And it's Shell Gas. Y'all know about Shell. Shell is in the United States, which is Britain. Total Energies, which is all over France. And then Eni International, which is in Italy. Now, we remember Italy headquarters two of the different units under AFRICOM. So these are not mistakes. These are not coincidences. These are strategic choices. When the West and NATO, when they set precedents for foreign presence on the African continent, it opens the floodgates for all sort of extractive practices, including this. And altogether, those three companies own a combined 51% stock. So they own majority stake in the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation. The Nigerian, 51%. Britain, France, and Italy, Nigerian. And over 400 million people in Nigeria are living in poverty. Manufactured poverty, mind you. But this is permitted because of oil executives like, I won't call him goofy. He's a little goofy, but Wale over here on the right, who is a Nigerian oil executive, multimillionaires, because they're making these deals with the devil to sell out their people. Again, the spoils of capitalism will have you believe that, yeah, we're bringing in money for Nigeria. We're gonna do all these great things for our people. These foreign investors wanna build up our economy, but the only thing they're building up is his pockets. It's important to understand that when we talk about executives like Wale right here, um, they are of a higher class, and this is kind of like a point of this is like a point of contention. It is in my opinion, it's a deeply academic debate. But this man, at least I don't consider him to be like a part of the bourgeoisie because the bourgeoisie is a very specific colonial title. This man is just a pawn in capitalism. He is very, 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 very rich, but he's a pawn nonetheless. They can strip this, they being NATO, they being the West, they can strip him of his wealth at any point in time, whenever they want. So while he is in a higher class in terms of like the like Nigerian caste system, um he is not like a bourgeois necessarily. He may be aspiring to that clearly. Um but again, the spoils of capitalism have attracted this lifestyle to him. And in turn, we have 400 million people in Nigeria who are living in manufactured poverty. So the second pillar that justifies AFRICOM is the fake threat of terrorism. The reason I'm saying the fake threat of terrorism is because we know the real terrorists are the US government. And it is one of the many justifications that the West uses to carry out different imperial projects and military projects, not just in Africa, but across the globe. So after 9/11 and after W. Bush, the US government, they use xenophobia, they use fear mongering, they use a lot of the tactics we're seeing right now around ICE to insist that the US military they needed more money. They needed to expand. That way we can keep all of our precious white American babies safe. And not even just our precious white American babies. Also, we have to keep these poor, starving African children safe from terrorism. We know that's not true. We know it's a lie. They're the real terrorists, and the only thing that we need to be safe from is them. The West views citizens of African countries, not even just citizens of African countries, but we are talking about AFRICOM specifically, who have been ravaged by Western imperialism from the 1400s to now as potential extremists that need to be controlled and contained. And this fake threat of terrorism justifies is what they use to justify their presence in places like Egypt and the Horn of Africa, again, because of their proximity to West Asia. The third part of how they justify AFRICOM is competition with China. So the U.S. is expanding its military power a lot under AFRICOM for many reasons that we've discussed, but another significant one that we would be remiss not to cover is China's investment in Africa. This is a point of contention about whether China's investment can be considered imperialism. And again, the same reason I don't think that is a part of a bourgeoisie. Imperialism is a very specific colonial practice. And while China is investing a lot of money, they're not imperialists. Being an imperialist is a very specific thing to me. But China has funneled millions and millions and millions into African textile, light manufacturing, construction, and agricultural industries, providing a lot of support to countries that the West has abandoned, or is intentionally sanctioning as like a form of punishment for any resistance that they might have. And it does buy a fifth of like these exports. So China has they have extracted exports from the continent, but a lot of them are under what I would feel are closer to partnerships than what is happening with the US and NATO. And China isn't even the largest financial presence in Africa, and NATO still is. Like, I think the Western media likes to inflate the nature of China's presence in Africa, again, because we are living in the heart of empire. China bad, America good. So anything that China does is going to be painted as bad. We should always be critical of anyone who seeks to um, to export things from Africa, just because our goal as Pan-Africanists is to create a fully sustained all African economy or all African socialist movement. They don't need to export nothing to keep the lights on. But right now, I'm gonna pick China. Sorry. 3 years after AFRICOM began, also China did take 30% of the continent's oil from Sudan, Angola, and the Congo. So that is kind of the driving force of why one of the driving forces of why the US is like, we have to keep Africa or else China is going to take Africa away from us. As if Africa is something to be taken. You know what I mean? This is a piece from 3 years ago. I was able to find a lot more modern ones, but the screenshot didn't fit on the slides. But there is recent posts, or excuse me, recent articles published in the last like 3 months about this very thing of the US China rivalry in Africa. And again, China's activity on the continent does influence the US's strategies for maintaining AFRICOM. And the American government and the American government and military officials see this dynamic of China investing in Africa as a threat. They see it as a threat of their dominance over the continent and like their strategic position near West Asia. So that is something to consider when we're thinking about the presence of China in Africa, but also more importantly, the vast expansion of AFRICOM. And this is for Giovanna.
Yes, thank you, comrade. Um, so yeah, we just spoke Peyton spoke extensively about AFRICOM and thinking about the US in the West expansion, both militaristically but also economically on the African continent. But I think it's incredibly timely and imperative to talk about US imperialism and militaristic expansion in the Caribbean. Um, because recently, I think most of us, if not all of us, have heard about the airstrikes, the six airstrikes on boats in Venezuelan waters. I think this really ties into this idea of CARICOM combining with AFRICOM and just thinking about how these organizations are vessels for American imperialism and chauvinism. And so CARICOM, and I didn't realize this, and I made this connection as Peyton was talking, but we think of AFRICOM as Africa Command, and CARICOM has the same kind of structure, but it's meant to represent Caribbean community. So it stands for Caribbean community, which I think is very interesting. And I feel like there could be a larger discussion about like what it means for Caribbean countries to um, appropriate, I guess. I don't know if that's the right term, but appropriate a title that is used on the African continent to symbolize like Western expansion and militarism for their quote unquote like Caribbean community. Um, and if we think about AFRICOM as a system, as a colonial and imperial project that protects US military and imperial interests, what does CARICOM do? If it has the same ending of COM, like that's a very intentional choice on behalf of Caribbean countries and leaders. But getting more into CARICOM, it was established in July of 1974 by leaders of Barbados, Guyana, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago. I think these are also very interesting. And if we had more time, we wanted to do an activity where we were mapping anti-colonial struggles with like AFRICOM sites. I think that would have been really interesting also thinking about the Caribbean because Barbados, Guyana, Jamaica, also Trinidad and Tobago have very extensive anti-colonial and anti-imperialist movement histories. But yeah, these countries came together to establish CARICOM with this idea of economic integration, foreign policy coordination amongst Caribbean islands, human and social development and security. Um, but, as we'll get into, CARICOM essentially serves as a vessel for American imperialism and chauvinism. And bringing it back to the example of the airstrikes on Venezuelan boats, at the beginning of September, the day before the reported military strike in the Caribbean, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago rejected claims by Venezuelan President Maduro about the growing presence of U.S. warships in the southern Caribbean Sea that aim to target Venezuela. And in her own words, she said, quote, "There's no evidence of any planned attack against Venezuela by the American Navy." And the very next day, the U.S. carried out a military strike against a Venezuelan boat. And in response to this, on the following down September 3rd, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago did not denounce these strikes. She actually voiced support of these strikes, and also for the continued violent murders of alleged drug traffickers by the U.S. military. So, not just denouncing, not denouncing at all, but also encouraging this violent overreach um, of U.S. militaristic tactics, which I think is incredibly important. And a lot of Caribbean countries are talking about, this growing threat of like drug trafficking speedboats that are in the Caribbean waters and heading towards Venezuela or coming from Venezuela. And I think CARICOM also preaches this like zone of peace, like viewing the Caribbean as a zone of peace. Um, And then we are then forced to think about like how is this peace enforced through military airstrikes carried out by the U.S. Military, which are backed vocally and rhetorically by Caribbean leaders. Um, Two other things I wanted to mention was thinking about Cuba. So I believe it was Trump. Um, actually, no, it might have been Biden as well, but both of those niggas, you know what I mean? So Cuba has been on the state sponsors of terrorism list since the 80s. And recently, I believe it was Trump who said that countries in the Caribbean who accept Cuban doctors would be sanctioned and would have their US visas revoked. The Bayesian prime minister, and I'm forgetting her name now, but she was very vocal in her support of Cuban doctors and saying that, Barbados wouldn't have gotten through the peak or the beginning of the COVID pandemic without Cuban doctors and medicine from Cuba. And she was saying, I'm willing to lose my U.S. visa for this. She eventually backtracked, and she kept her visa and she kept her status in the Bayesian government. And I think that's a really poignant example about the effects of CARICOM and how it serves as this vessel for American imperialism. You know, yes, countries can speak out for Cuba, but I don't think that it's about this imagined or material sense of solidarity, but rather a reliance on the labor of Cuban doctors. So what would have actually looked like if the Bayesian prime minister was like, yeah, we're going to stand on this. You could take my visa away, but we stand in solidarity with the Cuban people who are taking their health into their own hands and training their doctors to care for not only the Cuban people, but also the people of the Caribbean and also people of the world as well. Um, and the last example is thinking about Haiti and how members of CARICOM, primarily Jamaica, have announced, and this announcement came in September 2024, but the Prime Minister of Jamaica announced that 24 troops will be sent to Haiti to quote unquote fight gang violence that's currently happening in Haiti. And I feel like we should have a longer conversation about the history of Haiti and the funneling of arms and weaponry by the U.S. into Haiti. Um, but yeah, I think it's really fascinating to think of Jamaica as this sort of like mediator between like U.S. imperialism and also the destruction of the Haitian country, the Haitian population. But also, it's important to note that Jamaica wasn't the first nation to do this. Kenya was originally the first nation that sent troops to Haiti, and so we're thinking about this destruction of a Pan-African project. What does it mean for Black nations across the African diaspora to send troops to quote unquote fight gang violence in Haiti rather than understand that, again, what I was saying, this funneling of arms by the US military, by the West, and how since the independence of Haiti, there has been an intentional and deliberate project to repress the Haitian people and any sort of history of liberation that comes out of the island. Um, so those are just some things to think about when we're closing this idea of understanding AFRICOM, but also CARICOM. And like I was saying before when we started, it's important to understand our enemies. And I think it's also important to understand that our enemies are everywhere that we are. And so I guess after this short break that we're going to talk about, Black people are everywhere, our enemies are everywhere. And so how do we resist and how have we resisted historically? So now we are going to have a 5-minute break if you want to go to the next slide. But yes, we want to start. Oh, you always get me. Thank you. Okay, so this is the second portion of our teaching, where we are continuing to ground our understanding of global Blackness, where enemies are and where our people are, and thinking about Pan-Africanism. Um, so can you go back one slide, please? Sorry, thank you. Okay, so first, what is Pan-Africanism? If people want to come off mute or put in the chat, um, what you conceptualize as Pan-Africanism, what kind of like symbols or people, leaders, works you typically associate with the Pan-African tradition. Um, I think it's important to understand like where we're coming at this from and like how we can construct an idea of Pan-Africanism together. So if people have ideas of what Pan-Africanism is, please put it in the chat or come off mute.
To me, Pan-Africanism is the idea that all Black people, all African people are one people politically, socially, especially in the context of um, like colonialism and empire. And I also think of Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, when I think of Pan-Africanism.
Perfect. Kwame Ture, we're going to be getting into him. Marcus Garvey, I'm seeing in the chat, shared purpose of unity and liberation of all in the African diaspora. I think that also speaks something that Peyton was saying. Um, so yeah, y'all low-key don't really need me here, but I guess we will get into it. Next slide, please. Okay, so just for a historical grounding to answer the question, what is Pan-Africanism? There is no singular definition, which is kind of affirming, but also, we're thinking about like how to bring this back into an organizing practice. It's kind of unsettling of like how do we communicate this to the masses. But as I'll talk about, there may be like different interpretations of Pan-Africanism, but there are common threads that we can look towards. But yeah, as I was saying, there's no singular definition. One idea that I've really gravitated towards was articulated by George Jefferson, who is a white British historian of Africa. I feel like we should be critical of white British historians of Africa, but he had this really amazing text that I think is called like What is Pan-Africanism? Where he articulated this differentiation and dichotomy between Pan-Africanism with the uppercase P and Pan-Africanism with the lowercase p. Um, so Pan-Africanism with the uppercase P is a clearly recognizable movement of intellectuals. When we're thinking about the theorization and development of a Pan-African ideology, we can point towards this like uppercase, like intellectual academic movement. And I think somebody that really can ground us in that understanding is W.E.B. Du Bois. I think his work is I can't even I don't think there's a word to describe how influential it is on the black masses, on the black world. But like he was an organizer, he organized Pan-African conferences and congresses, but he wasn't on the boot like on the ground, boots to the ground type of organizer. I think we can consider him to be an intellectual, which is nonetheless essential to our liberation movements. But so when we're thinking about this uppercase Pan-Africanism, we can point towards W.E.B. Du Bois. When we're thinking about this lowercase Pan-Africanism, we're thinking about more of a grassroots movement that features predominant cultural elements. And so somebody who we can point towards is Marcus Garvey, like somebody had said in the chat. And I think it's funny to use these two examples because they did have historical beef. And W.E.B. Du Bois was very critical of Marcus Garvey and his development of the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which, in my opinion, was one of the most successful, if not the most successful, Black liberation organizing body in our history. Um, and so, Marcus Garvey was also an author. He had works that leaders that we look up to today, Kwame Nkrumah was very heavily influenced by Marcus Garvey. So I think it's important to note that these terms are not mutually exclusive. Somebody who is, in the lowercase Pan-Africanism circle and discourse can also be an intellectual that we look towards in the movement. Um, Another idea that I think is also really important is something that was articulated by Minka Makalani, who is a professor of Africa and African diaspora studies at UT Austin, I believe. He may be at Johns Hopkins now, but he was thinking about this idea that Pan-Africanism is, quote, a belief that African people, both on the African continent and in the diaspora, share not merely a common history, but a common destiny. And I'll get into this in the next slide, but I think there's a lot in this definition, even though it's very brief. It clearly identifies that we're thinking about the African continent and the African diaspora. And as I was saying, Black people are everywhere. So we're thinking about North America, we're thinking about Canada, we are thinking about the Caribbean, we're thinking about South America, Europe, Australia, Melanesia, the Pacific. I think there's a really interesting history and vast history of Pan-African and Black organizing in Melanesia. The people of Papua New Guinea conceive themselves as African, conceive themselves as Black. So therefore, like we have this global reach. We're thinking about global Blackness. And to continue further with this definition that Makalani had put forward, it's about a common history. And so Pan-Africanism is time-bound. We're thinking about the start of this war, of this genocide that we conceptualize as Black life, which started with the transatlantic slave trade. Um, we were all historically in this place that white colonizers called Africa. We didn't consider ourselves to be African. We consider ourselves to be part of different ethnic groups. But we came under this imagined collective of the African identity. And we have this common history of how we've traversed the Atlantic, the Pacific, um, to, create an identity in these different parts of the world. And also in that comes a common destiny. I think the most contentious part is like, what is that common destiny for us? And I think that's something that Pan-Africanists are always thinking through. But I think I just want to highlight that when we're thinking about Pan-Africanism, it's about a common history and a common destiny. And this idea of a common destiny can also be articulated through Kwame Nkrumah. Um, for those who don't know, he was the first African-born president or prime minister of Ghana. It was very influential in the Ghanaian independence movement and influential in just the discourse of Pan-Africanism to this day. Um, and on March 6th, 1957, which was the day that Ghana gained independence, he said in his speech, quote, "Our independence is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of Africa." And I think that is incredibly powerful and clear-sighted and profound to express on the day that your nation is gaining independence and achieving a liberation struggle that was, fought for centuries, right? To say, we're basking in this victory, but it's completely meaningless unless the entire African continent is liberated, which I think is very powerful for us to think about. And then always going back to Marcus Garvey, I think he's an incredible and important person to study. But Marcus Garvey also said, Pan-Africanism also a vision in which all people of African origin are united, self-sufficient, and proud. And I think this idea of proud is something that I'll return to when we're thinking about culture and its relationship to the Pan-African movement. So we can keep moving forward. And so yes, like I was saying, there are different definitions or differing definitions of Pan-Africanism, but there are so many common threads that we're going to be going through. So going back to the definition that Makalani put forward, African people and people of the African diaspora are united by a common history and destiny. Again, what is that destiny? There's contention around that. But the idea of a common history, I think, is very grounding, and it is something that we can always point towards when we're trying to organize around a Pan-African ideology in organizing spaces. And then the second idea that Pan-Africanism can only be achieved through revolutionary and collective organizing, education, and struggle. And I think there's a difference between a cultural Pan-Africanism and a revolutionary Pan-Africanism. And many organizations that we're a part of think about Pan-Africanism as this unification of the African people under the economic system of of socialism. And a Pan-African future is achieved through a process of scientific socialism. So we're thinking about how the labor of Black bodies and the reduction of Blackness and anti-Blackness as a whole has structured this entire society, has structured this world. And Black people have created the foundation of the global economic system. And in order for us to be liberated, we must overturn that system through a process of scientific investigation, through an understanding of socialism as a tool of liberation, whereas capitalism is kind of the force that keeps us in this state of oppression and repression. Um, and then to keep moving forwards, thinking about this continental unity. So again, we identify ourselves as Africans, as new Africans, as Black people, but we understand our history is tied to the African continent. Then it's rooted in history, which I feel like I went over, but understanding that, when we're thinking about the development of Pan-Africanism, we can point towards the dispersal of African people through the transatlantic slave trade. Many people point towards Haiti as it was the first Black nation in the Western Hemisphere, but it was, I think, when during its liberation struggle and eventual victory, it was a Pan-African project. And its first constitution said that Haiti was like a homeland for African people. And I'm now thinking like I wish I brought like an archive, like I had some sort of archive like talking about that constitution, but I think that's also very, very important to note that the first free Black nation in the Western Hemisphere was creating a homeland for Africans to always be safe and to return to. Um, and then to end on this idea, we're thinking about common threads, this idea that no African is free until all Africans are free. And that kind of relates back to what Kwame Nkrumah was saying, that the independence of separate African nations is meaningless unless we're all liberated. So let's keep moving forward. Okay, and also if people have questions, feel free to come off mute or put it in the chat. I feel like I'm going kind of fast just because of like time. But I also want to like hear from people in the questions that I pose. So yeah, when I was referring back to Marcus Garvey, he was saying that Pan-Africanism is this vision where all African people are united, self-sufficient, and proud. And so pride for me, I think is best articulated through culture. I think a lot of people are proud of their culture and see it as an important part of their identities and central to their understanding of Pan-Africanism. And so I kind of want to take like a few minutes to think about culture in a Pan-African revolution. Um, and so I feel like in a contemporary context, when we think about Pan-Africanism, a cultural Pan-Africanism versus revolutionary Pan-Africanism, we usually point towards like Black Americans moving back to Ghana or places on the African continent, building a home and taking up very material space, and economic space to establish their life on the African continent under this guise of like Pan-Africanism or like returning back to the motherland, and like where we all originate from, which I think is very fascinating. I think people conceptualize Pan-Africanism in a contemporary context as like people going to Nigeria in December when like all the parties are happening and when it's summer and stuff like that. And even like this, thinking about Burna Boy as this like symbol of Pan-Africanism. And like, although he has a few songs that talk about the material conditions of Nigerians, of working class Nigerians, does that actually promote an ideology and a politic of Pan-Africanism? That is up for people to decide by themselves, but I do not think that it does. I think merely just acknowledging our oppression and acknowledging our material conditions doesn't necessarily translate into a revolutionary Pan-African ideology. And so I want to have like a mini case study, thinking about thinking about two kind of figures in African diasporic history, which I think are very fascinating, and I would have never thought to like put them together. Um, the Fela Kuti, who was arguably like the father of Afrobeats, a Nigerian artist, and who I have a picture of his 1977 album, Sorrow, Tears and Blood. And he released the song Colonial Mentality, which is a beautiful song. If people, I recommend listening to it. He released that in 1977. I mean, 1977, following attack on his communal compound by the Nigerian army. And so for him, he's using music and this language of Afro beats and this language of jazz, this jazz fusion to communicate, like what is our role as Africans? It's not to be, like the boots on the ground figure of US and Western imperialism. We have to be self-sufficient, we have to be proud, we have to be united as a continent. And that's where he's getting into this like colonial mentality. He's pointing out that many Nigerian um, army members of the army have this colonial mentality where they see themselves as part of like a Western imagined community rather than a Nigerian and African community. Um, so yeah, I think Fela Kuti is an amazing example of thinking about culture in a Pan-African revolution that is actually pushing towards like a revolutionary politic. Another person we could think about in contrast is Ron Karenga, who was the founder of the U.S. organization in the U.S. It doesn't stand for United States, but it's just U.S. organization, which organizes around this idea of operational unity. And it's an idea that combines the values of Ujima, which is collective work and responsibility, and Umoja, which is unity, and posits that all degrees of Black life are valuable and must be given equal respect. And beyond him, because it was, he received money from the FBI and was like also called an FBI informant. Beyond the work of the U.S. organization, he was also known as the founder of Kwanzaa, the holiday that Black Americans celebrate in December. And so there's a conversation there where we're uniting around these principles, these quote unquote like African principles of unity and collective work and responsibility. But again, like how does Kwanzaa translate into a revolutionary Pan-African ideology and practice? If we are just thinking about the colors red, black, and green, but we're not, advocating for the liberation of the African continent, if we're not advocating for the liberation of the Caribbean, what is that? What does any of that mean? And so I think those are two very important figures that we could juxtapose and which brings us to this like broader question of like what is the role of culture in a political and social Pan-African revolution? And so I don't know if people have an answer, what if people want to come off mute or put it in the chat. But where do we think culture lies in this Pan-African revolution?
I mean, for me, culture, let me turn my camera back on. For me, culture is like, it's everything, dog. Like, culture is how we keep the bonds of like our organizing together. When I think of like the Cuban Revolution, they really prioritize culture. And having some sort of cultural identity in the Cuban Revolution, like to Cuba as a place, was really important. But if we think of it as like, if we think of a Pan-African nation, we can get into nationhood. That's a whole other teaching. But um, like the culture a of being an African, whether that's in the diaspora, in any part of the diaspora, like the cultural connectivity, I think is what will support and like recharge us like when we're really in the thick of it. Um and I think this is something that like our ops understand. Like that's why I hope that you all have seen Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat. But if you haven't, it's kind of touching on this, exactly what Javon has been saying. But like our ops would send our people, our cultural our drivers of culture to the continent to like dissuade revolutionary activity. It didn't work, but like I think culture is it kind of feels like a one-to-one to me of like as we're doing organizing, as we're doing the hard work, as we're taking up arms, we have to have a strong culture to tie us together to like remind us of like what we're doing any of this for.
Yeah, and I think also like um being like remembering our roots is so important as well. Like there are so many like threads that connect like for Africans who have been displaced, like there are so many threads that connect us back to the continent. So I think like remembering like remembering that a lot of us have a shared history, and within that like the cultures that have been developed from like either displacement or just like continuing in response to colonialism while being on the continent and that type of
Yeah, if people have more reflections, please put them in the chat. But I think like those two observations are really beautiful when we're thinking about culture as this thing that we can always turn back to. And when the organizing is said and done, and like the theory is said and done, like we can turn towards like our material culture to ground us in our history. Because again, like going back to this idea of Pan-Africanism, we have a common history. Um, but as Peyton was saying, like culture is something that also can be manipulated by our enemies. And Daruba bin Wahad has this essay in Imprisoned Intellectuals, and I'm forgetting the name of the essay, but he's essentially talking about culture and saying how, the development of this black misleadership class exploited our culture. Like they made it seem like they were at the forefront of our struggle, and the way that they did that was communicating like we have to be proud, we have to be black and proud, we have to have this like very strong cultural element, but then that didn't necessarily translate into doing something politically, like organizing our people. And so I think like what we're getting at is how can we use this idea of culture that brings a lot of people together. When we're thinking about Afro beats, people can listen to Fela Kuti and automatically have like this visceral connection to it. But how do we, or Burna Boy or whoever, but like how do we turn that into energy that could be channeled into revolutionary work? Um, and yeah, what was put in the chat, culture can often be people's first introduction to revolutionary work. I completely agree. And I think as I was just saying, like, through music, through language, through cultural symbols, the Pan-African flag, I feel like people have so many attachments to that, even if they don't acknowledge it as like the Pan-African flag. Like we have a very material like connection to red, black, and green. We're thinking about what they really symbolize. So I think it's incredibly important for us as organizers, as people who are aligned with a Pan-African politic, to understand the role of culture in an organizing space. So you can move to the next slide, please. Okay. So just to put some faces to the concept, we can look at a few Pan-Africanist leaders throughout history. We'll go through this quickly because niggas already know who these people are. But Malcolm X has this very important quote where he says, "You cannot understand what is going on in Mississippi if you don't understand what is going on in the Congo. And you cannot really be interested in what's going on in Mississippi if you are not also interested in what's going on in the Congo." And I think something I want to say really quickly is I think that's really beautiful for him to observe because he also identified Patrice Lumumba, who was a Pan-Africanist leader of the DRC, as, like the most influential and like powerful man, like African man in the world. And so again, like making that connection, like you can't even understand what's going on in Mississippi if you don't understand what happened on the African continent, thinking about what's happening in the DRC. Um, Again, going back to Kwame Nkrumah, he said, "I'm not African because I was born in Africa, because Africa was born in me." And I think this kind of goes back to like this cultural element of like, what does it mean for Africa to be born in me? What are these values that are instilled in me that I can carry with my body throughout the world as I go through the diaspora? So you can go to the next slide. Thank you. And then Kwame Ture, who we've pointed out as when we think about Pan-Africanism, we often point towards Kwame Ture, which we rightfully should. And he says we cannot look to our oppressors, those who oppress us, to liberate us, or to even help in our liberation, for they will and must serve their own interest, which always involves oppressing us, the African peoples. And I'd also relate this back to our recent post on Robert F. Williams, where he had a quote in a similar vein that like we can't look to our oppressors to liberate us because their survival is built on our repression and like violence against our people. And so a few other people that are, Pictured below, who I think are also incredibly important to highlight, aside from Kwame Ture, is Amy Jacks Garvey, who is the second wife of Marcus Garvey, who really, for lack of a better term, held it down when he was in prison for mail fraud, for alleged mail fraud. And she had a segment in the UNI official paper, The Negro World, where she's thinking about the segment was called Are Women and What They Think. And so she was also a very influential woman in a Black feminist tradition and project. I think she deserves to be studied extensively. The next woman next to her is Amy Ashwood Garvey, who was the first wife of Marcus Garvey. He's very messy for marrying two people named Amy, but she was somebody that has been pushed out of the history of the UNIA. But I conceptualize her as like the co-founder of the UNIA. She was incredibly influential in establishing it and creating this global reach of the UNIA through its newspaper, through stock in the Black Star Line, and any sort of like tradition in the UNIA and Marcus Garvey, we should also be attributing to Amy Ashwood Garvey. In the middle, W.E.B. Du Bois. I feel like we've all seen him, intellectual. I feel like there's a lot to be said, but we can move on. The next person next to him is Edward Blyden, who was an American Liberian educator who was also very influential in the development of the Liberian state. And then we have Guyanese historian Walter Rodney, who is also incredibly influential when we're thinking about an African Marxist, like decolonial Marxist understanding. Um, his work is incredibly influential. What is it like how Europe underdeveloped the West or underdeveloped Africa? I think that is a required reading for anybody who ascribes himself to a Pan-African tradition. He also has a really great speech that was delivered on African Liberation Day, 1972, in San Francisco, where he's also thinking about, we must identify ourselves as African people because we are all African people. So we can move to the next slide. So now we're going to be thinking about current Pan-Africanist struggles because again, although we're tracing Pan-Africanism through this like historical lens, and so because we're tracing it, we can also see remnants, very prominent remnants in our contemporary context. So we can go to the next slide. So the most prominent one is the Alliance of the Sahel States, the AES, which people can also refer to it as. It consists right now of Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. Those three states withdrew from the regional bloc ECOWAS in January of 2025 this year. ECOWAS stands for the Economic Community of West African States. Um, and so Yes, I just lost my train of thought. But they withdrew from this regional bloc and established this alliance of the Sahel states. And Black Alliance for Peace, as well as the All African People's Revolutionary Party, have amazing teach-ins going into a more extensive history and overview of the alliance of the Sahel states. But it was born out of Mali's coup in August 2020. It was then followed by Burkina Faso's coup in September 2022, and then Niger in 2023, where they kicked out French troops. And I have an image of the French troops leaving in the bottom right. Um, they instituted a Sahel-wide passport system. There is no longer a fee for people of the Sahel to get a visa to travel to other states within the alliance. And we can also point towards when we're thinking about like a figurehead, who's also a boots on the ground organizer, um, President Ibrahim of Burkina Faso. And I think he is really beautifully and powerfully illuminating the legacy of Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso and a few things that he's done, and there is a list of accomplishments. He instituted the Presidential Initiative for Agricultural Production and Food Self-Sufficiency. So this is really putting agricultural production into the hands of the youth, getting the youth to understand like how do I, grow food for myself and my community. He has, I don't know if nationalized is the right word, but has nationalized like processing plants. So, like tomato processing plants and other processing plants that are throughout the region. And he's also rejected loans from the IMF and World Bank. And I think that's a very significant statement, which I think signifies this creation of a Pan-African world within the Alliance of the Sahel states. What does it mean to reject material funds, predatory loans from the IMF and World Bank, and promote the economic cooperation between the Alliance of the Sahel states? So I think it's important as us as Pan-Africanists, people who ascribe to a Pan-African politic, to continue to stay updated on what's happening in the AES, but also be vigilant of media that seeks to twist and water down and also reframe the accomplishments that are happening on the continent, but particularly in that region. So we can keep going. Another current Pan-Africanist struggle that I think is really unique to highlight, that I've been thinking about a lot, is the pardoning of Marcus Garvey. So in the final days of Biden's presidency, a posthumous pardon was granted to Marcus Garvey, who was in prison for mail fraud, as I was saying. This came after nearly 2 decades of legal advocacy work by descendants of Marcus Garvey. But Amy Jacks Garvey, his second wife, really began this call for his pardon in 1923. And for me, when I first heard about it, I was like, okay, Marcus Garvey has been an ancestor for decades. Why now? And I think something that was articulated in an article about this pardoning was that the goal of the pardon wasn't, it wasn't it was not to, give credit to the Biden administration for understanding this injustice in the world. It's more so to restore the dignity of Marcus Garvey's global movement. And I feel like recently, at least in my spaces on Twitter and like social media, a lot of people have denounced Marcus Garvey and like said that he was not a real Pan-Africanist leader and organizer. And I think that that really undermines the global impact of the UNIA. And like I was saying, like I truly think the UNIA is one of the most successful Black liberation movements and struggles that we've seen in the world, and we must study it as people of a Black radical tradition, of a Pan-African tradition. And so when I think about the part of Marcus Garvey and connecting it back to a Pan-African struggle, we're thinking about honoring the legacy of our revolutionaries, of our ancestors, and also listening to the descendants of Marcus Garvey. If they put out this call, it's our obligation and duty to support it. So we can go to the next slide. And then I think another current and very urgent and intentional Pan-Africanist struggle that we should be organizing around is the liberation of Haiti, Sudan, and the DRC. And again, we're coming close to time, so I can't go too extensively in it, but I think that, again, I think I was saying this before, but anti-Blackness holds the society up. Like it literally makes the society function. And we have seen anti-Blackness get in the way of people expressing solidarity for the Haitian people, for the Sudanese people, for the Congolese people, for decades, dare I say, centuries. And so I think it's important, in a project that we must be committed to, is re-articulating our commitment to these Black nations and their self-determination projects, but also liberation projects from the West, from economic exploitation. And, we're thinking about the DRC and we're thinking about Sudan, how natural resources have been a source of, I don't want to say conflict to reduce it, but conflict and proxy wars that have been started by the West, that have been started by the UAE. Um, so yeah, and again, I've spoke extensively about Haiti and thinking about this economic and militaristic backing by the United States, but we're seeing the West infiltrate these nations to destroy them, and I think our goal and our mission as Pan-Africanists is to rebuild a project and a politic that supports their liberation struggles. We can go to the next slide. Okay, yeah. And so we can continue thinking about these different examples of contemporary Pan-Africanist struggles, but I think the important thing is that the struggle continues. What is it? Eluda continua. The struggle continues. We're thinking about, that's a reference to the Mozambican liberation movement of the 70s. But, Pan-Africanism and a Pan-African project, something that we're always going to be working towards because, again, anti-Blackness permeates the maintenance of the society. And so when we're thinking about the struggle, we're thinking about reparations, but also repatriation. And I'm somebody that's very interested in museums. And so we're thinking about the looting of African artifacts. We're thinking about the Benin bronzes that have been stolen from modern day Nigeria. That I think that is also a project that we should be invested in, the returning of those artifacts, the returning of human remains of, important spiritual artifacts that belong to our communities wherever we may be. We're thinking about the struggle. We're also understanding capitalist imperialist exploitation. We're thinking about carcerality, the security and surveillance state, which is much more prominent and in our face now. And we can, have a larger conversation about that at some point. I think we should probably have like a text on that about the surveillance state and carcerality, but it's something that like we constantly need to be thinking about because it has constantly been in our communities. We're thinking about Blackness in the environment. That's another component of a Pan-Africanist struggle that we should be understanding, how our physical environment is being destroyed through economic exploitation and is harming our communities and our health. And then also deinstitutionalizing knowledge, which is something that BKC seeks to, do to take the resources out of the university and bring it back to the community and deconstruct what it means to produce knowledge and have that knowledge be valuable. Um, and so, kind of what this point says, global anti-Blackness necessitates a strong global Black resistance, and our struggles are interconnected. And I think something that June Jordan had said in an interview was that Brooklyn to Angola is not a big leap to the Reagan administration. So therefore, we should be making those connections as well. If our enemies are making those connections, we should be making those connections as Pan-Africanists. Um, I think Peyton's laptop died, but that was essentially like the last bit of information that we had to go through, and we're thinking about what is Pan-Africanism in a contemporary context. The next portion would have been a discussion about Pan-Africanism and organizing, but I know we are 2 minutes over time, so I guess this is just something that we can continue to think about as we leave this Zoom room, which I thought was very beautiful and a really great space of theorizing and strategizing and thinking about AFRICOM, but also Pan-Africanism. And so what I want to end on is this idea that Pan-African liberation and the Pan-African tradition is rich in organizing strategies. And there's so much that we can learn from our ancestors, from our revolutionaries. Oh, thank you, Jen. There's so much we can learn from our ancestors, our revolutionaries, about these practices. And even like we had a recent post on Robert F. Williams, who was thinking in an internationalist lens, but was, centered in Monroe, North Carolina, but eventually was exiled to Cuba, and then China, Tanzania, and really all around the world. But he has very, very rich organizing tactics and strategies that he's written down in his books. And so picking those out, making that accessible to people, Kwame Ture is probably the number one person we should be studying. We're thinking about outreach and base building. Like he was in the field with people. We're thinking about his time during SNCC. Um, and so yeah, I think just to really emphasize that this tradition of Pan-Africanism is incredibly rich in organizing strategies, and we should constantly be referring back to it. And it's essential to ground ourselves in Pan-Africanism because imperialism first manifested in Africa. We're thinking about the carving up of the continent, of its economic exploitation, of its gendered exploitation, and class-based, and color-based exploitation as well. I think we need to understand that we have a common history and therefore like a common destiny, and we should ground ourselves in a Pan-African tradition. And so a question I want to leave people on is how can we incorporate Pan-African ideologies into our organizing work, taking the things that we just discussed for the past 2 hours, um, into our respective organizations, even if we're not in organizations, how can we incorporate this into our everyday lives? When we talk to people, how do we engage with them on this plane of Pan-Africanism? When we're thinking about culture as a uniting force that brings people together, how can we bring people together when we're thinking about culture, but then turn that into a revolutionary act? Um, and so we can go to the next slide, which is a thank you. I know this was really long. This was a lot of information. Um, I think this is our like one of our first times like doing a fully remote teach-in. So thank you all for staying with us. Um, and we will continue to release more text and hopefully do more events in person, but also virtually. But yes, I hope you all took something away from this presentation. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask us or DM us on Instagram or email us, but also get involved and become a member of VKC. Um, and yeah, I don't know if any of my other comrades have any closing remarks.
Thank you for Javon. Thank you for hello. Thank you, Javada. Sorry, my computer died. She's old, and I don't feel good about buying a new computer. I'm still trying to navigate that.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, but yeah, I appreciate y'all so much. I had fun. I love teachings. Um, and this is our first remote one in a while, like Giovanna said. So, we're gonna put this up on YouTube in case you wanna watch anything over. And yeah, if you wanna get involved, hit us up on Instagram or through the link that Jen shared earlier. We always need more people to help us write and research because we are abundant in ideas, pero we are not abundant in time. So if you even just have a few hours a week that you can commit to helping us out, it is greatly appreciated. And this week is also Congo week. So stay
Yeah.
tuned. Judan is working on something for Instagram about Congo week. And then we also on our website have resources on the Congo from last year. Um, but with that being said, thank y'all. Good night.